Hi, everybody. Christ is in our midst. This is the second installment of our class, our book study on Father Patrick Henry Reardon's The Trial of Job. And I have a handy little microphone that someone gave me to attach to the video this week, so hopefully everybody out there can hear a little better. If you were with us last week, then you know that we only made it through chapter 2. We started with the introduction and came through chapter 2. And so today we'll be picking up with chapter 3 and hopefully working our way through chapter 7. We'll go for about an hour. So without further ado then, let's begin our class. As usual, for those of you out there in Facebook land, feel free to type in your questions, and I will do my very best to get to them. We will try to answer those questions as they come, and comments are welcome as well. So here we go. Beginning in chapter 3, what changes stylistically? What's happening that's different at the beginning of chapter 3? That's right. That's where the book changes to poetry. And the style of the literature isn't the only thing that changes. Job's mood or his disposition changes as well. How is Job different beginning in chapter 3? He curses the day he was born. That's right. Job has taken a sort of a dark turn here with his lament. And while he is not cursing God, he is certainly being very unequivocal about how he feels about his situation, about the state of things. And that's expressed most powerfully in his wish that he'd never been born. It would be better that I had never been born than to have gone through what I am going through now. Very powerful, very strong feeling, but not one that's probably unfamiliar to anyone who has ever experienced a great deal of tragedy, even perhaps just in passing. If you've lost a child or someone unexpectedly, that's perhaps a feeling that you can relate to.
I think of the movie It's a Wonderful Life, where Jimmy Stewart says, I wish I was never born, and then you see what happens if you weren't born. All the horrible things that happened to the town. He saved all these people from various things that happened, people going through the ice and the bad prescription and stuff. And then in the end, that shows you really shouldn't wish that you were never born, because you don't know all the wonderful things that you might have done.
You know, it's the nice thing about being a reader is that we have access to a perspective that Job doesn't have. Just like Jimmy's character in It's a Wonderful Life. He can't see. But having this perspective, maybe it allows us, when we experience tragedy ourselves, we can't gain access to that perspective in our own life, but maybe we can have the hope that that same thing is true for us. That even though we feel this way, that really ultimately that God is working out things for good, as it says, all things work together for good and for them who are in Christ Jesus, as St. Paul says. So, but definitely that tragic experience really wants to elicit that feeling from us that we would rather be dead than to go through what we're going through. What question does Job ask of God? Why? It's interesting. The story of Job in some ways is very far removed from our own experience. I mean, some things are so foreign they're just hard to imagine. The whole notion of stopping everything and sitting down and putting on rough clothes and sitting in ashes for a whole, and not saying anything for a whole week. this is completely foreign to our way of going about grieving, or just anything we could even imagine doing. But what's the first question we almost always ask when something terrible happens? Why? As a pastor, it's certainly the very first question that a lot of people ask me when you go to see them in the hospital. And it doesn't matter whether the tragedy or the sadness they're going through is something that they expected or not. Why is this happening? Why does God let things like this happen? Why does it have to be this way? Some iteration of that question is almost always one of the very first things that comes. Why do you think that is?
Some people don't have the depth of understanding. They don't have a relationship with God.
For some people, it's a crisis of faith. But there's another reason why people ask why, right at the beginning.
Well, people try to understand their world, so as if there's a rational reason for something. Psychologically, people just, why was there a house fire? Looking for what's at fault.
What would it give you to find an answer to that question? It might give you closure.
False sense of control.
There you go. It gives you a sense of control. You see, human suffering, tragedy, always or almost always feels like somebody's taken the snow globe and turned it upside down and shook it. Everything's discombobulated. Your feelings are discombobulated. Your sense of up and down, your whole world is uprooted, upset. And it's natural to want to find something to get a hold of that you can feel like you can hold on to. Some place where you can have a little bit of control, a little bit of understanding, something to put your feet on. And even though the answer to the question why almost never makes anybody feel better, why? Why did the house burn down, like you said? Oh, well, there was an electrical fire because there was a faulty wire in the wall. Even though that brings absolutely no comfort at all, it brings a sense of control. And when people are going through grief, they very often reach for something that gives them a sense that everything is not chaotic. Everything is not upside down. Something, even though it doesn't help at all in terms of dealing with what's going on inside of them, they're reaching for some sense of control, some sense of normalcy or stability. And of course, when we understand something, it helps.
The Orthodox, this is what I hear all the time. It is what it is. And that seems to be the answer all Orthodox say. And why did my baby die? Because it is what it is. Why did this happen? Because it is what it is. It's not explainable. It just is what it is. And I've used that so many times in things that go wrong. It just is what it is. So I wonder, is it just us Orthodox where that is what it is attitude, or is it?
Part of that response is dispositional. It's not always easy to come up with a reason, and theologically that's kind of it can be a kind of a dicey thing to do. If you come up with a reason, it may not be the right one. There are all kinds of and there's even a book that was just published about this. Cliches that aren't in the Bible, things Christians say as though they're theological truths that aren't in the Bible. For instance, everything happens for a reason, or God will never give you more than you can handle. Tell that to Job. So sometimes it can be a bit dicey to posit why someone is suffering. That doesn't stop Job's comforters. But are they right?
We were talking about the last one this afternoon, this phrase, burdens that are too heavy to bear, right? It's got to be in the Bible someplace. I mean, I know what it is in Slavonic, right? So it's got to be there someplace. But I don't know where preaching is at.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think so. And there are similar things where he talks about he won't allow his oh shoot, it's gone right out of my mind.
I meant to look it up, but I didn't.
But there's a big difference between what we feel like is too much and what God feels like is too much. Those things are not very often the same. And we don't realize how much we can bear until we're put into a situation that seems unbearable. And really, it's only when we come out of it on the other side that we look back and then we look back sometimes with amazement. I can't believe I went through that. Some things are unimaginable. You know, when you look at them from the outside, who can imagine going through a concentration camp? It's literally unimaginable. You can't even imagine such a thing and surviving it. And yet, people did. They bore an unbearable situation. The other reason that I think Orthodox tend not to want to theologize about it too much is, and this is one reason perhaps to reflect on in terms of how we deal with people who suffer, is that it doesn't, I mean, that's what Job's comforters try to do. They want to theologize about how we got into this situation. But it doesn't make things any better for Job. And it's not what he needs from them. He doesn't need them to tell him where he's wrong or to explain to him his situation. He needs them to be with him so that he's not alone. Maybe a big hug. He certainly needs to feel like he is not abandoned in that moment. And so sometimes when you get a kind of an ambivalent response to questions of why, perhaps the person recognizes that going into that is a sidetrack that's not really going to be very helpful in terms of what needs to happen right now. And this is reflected in our liturgical response to death as well. When someone dies, there are a lot of things that we have to do in that first few days after death. And traditionally, those things start happening right away. The person dies, ideally, or traditionally at home. And someone should be there reading Psalms. Other people have to go get water and sponges and clothes, and the body has to be washed and cleaned and dressed. And then if there's going to be a casket, and then casketed and then laid out in the house. And then people will keep vigil, and there will be psalms read for the full duration until the next day, at which point some strong young men are going to come and carry the casket to the church, and they'll go in procession. They'll sing the whole way. You get there, you have the funeral, and then there's the last kiss and the burial. All of this stuff that takes place over the first 1, 2, 3 days that has to be done. And that's because the church recognizes, and perhaps to some degree all traditional societies do, that what you really need right at the beginning is very tangible, simple things to be doing. Not sitting around reflecting on why this happens or all of this other stuff. What you need is very tangible little things to be doing as the beginning of working out your grief by doing things for them and for other people. And so that's how the church eases us into the process of going through grief, is in that most stark and shocking moment when the experience comes brand new. You have all these little loving but ordinary tasks to accomplish. And you work your way through those, and you work your way through them not alone but in community with other people. And it's a way of easing you into that process of coming to terms with the grief and the loss. That's what you need at the beginning. Theology ought to come later. So we have to resist the impulse to spend a lot of time there, like Job's comforters want to do. So the question that Job asks is why, which is a very natural question to ask when we're trying to put our feet on something and everything seems upside down. How does that question set the stage for what comes next, for what comes afterward?
You mean after the three men speak with him?
Well, Job's lament is one long why.
Right.
So that why sets the stage for the drama that follows. What is that? So if the question's not clear, then I'll just answer it myself. His why is the invitation for them then to begin offering their responses. Even though a savvy listener, and here's another cue for us as we well, I mean, you already know. There's another cue for us. We can learn a lot by observing what his comforters do and then not doing that. Is that why really a question for them?
This guy, Krishna, he makes that point that this is a rhetorical question, that the person who says, why me, doesn't really want someone to come and explain to them, well, it's because you were bad, or it's
Right.
because it's the overall plan for the universe. What the person really wants is somebody else to be there with them and agree with them and support them, but not necessarily try to explain things to them.
Right. Or just to listen to them. To let them express their inner world. And to be a little less alone, because you always feel sort of alone in your grief when you go through it. Because even if it's not just you that's grieving, no one else is you. And there's a whole internal world of feeling and thought that belongs to you and you alone. Talking about it and having someone else there to hear you and to respond by I'm listening or I'm here is a way of being able to work that out and feeling a little less alone. But it's not it's not an invitation to do what his comforters are about to do. They should have recognized that the question is, on some level, rhetorical. But they don't. And that sets up the drama that follows. And in that drama that follows, there's always, as we said in the first week, there are layers of significance and layers of meaning. He talks about the apocalyptic principle. The principle that there's always more happening than you can see right there on the surface. And those layers we delved into a little bit back then, but we'll have to keep an eye out for them as we continue. So, moving on to chapter 4 now. And we should congratulate ourselves on having made it through that chapter in only 20 minutes. What are the names of Job's comforters? Okay. And to whom are the three comforters possibly, perhaps even probably, related?
That part I didn't get.
Oh, that's because to get that part you would have had to have looked back outside of the text to the Old Testament references that are included there. They are these names are included in genealogical references to Abraham. So it's quite possible that all three of these comforters are descendants of Abraham through one of his concubines. So it's quite possible that they have some vestigial connection to Abraham's covenantal knowledge, relationship, understanding with God. So even though they are not from his wife, like Isaac, they're from his concubines, doubtless they would have at least some knowledge, awareness probably of his covenantal relationship with God, that experience, those encounters. And so maybe the whole context of Job here takes on a slightly more monotheistic tone or hue. Maybe they're a little bit more aware of the one true God and proto-Israel than one might otherwise be inclined to think. Maybe it's not as surprising as we would tend to think at the beginning of Job, that they're talking about the one God, and that we find that Job is a worshiper of the one God. Perhaps he too is in some way related to or familiar with Abraham and Abraham's world. Who does Eliphaz represent? Or what does Eliphaz represent?
He represents the direct relationship with God. He talks about his own spiritual experience as a basis for his advice to Job.
Right. He also, Father Patrick says, he also represents the wisdom of Edom. So this is a region of the Arabian Desert that is south and to the east of Palestine. It's going to be east of Egypt, north and east in Egypt, south and east of Palestine. So he represents the wisdom of the desert, where Father Patrick says only the wise survive. And if you've ever been out there, it does require some kind of savvy. It is hot and dry. And you mentioned this again at the beginning. What does Eliphaz base his initial speech to Job on? That's right. He bases it on his personal experience, his own personal experience and knowledge of God. And what are the core beliefs that Eliphaz has derived from his experience?
No one is innocent. No one is just. Everyone needs to be justified before God. And so, for that reason, he doesn't accept Job's protestations that he is an innocent man and that he doesn't deserve what's happening. Everybody deserves punishment. We're all evil. We're all sinners.
Right. Everyone deserves punishment. No one is innocent. God is completely holy, completely just, completely pure and undefiled. So he has a very high view of the justice and holiness of God, and a pretty low view of human beings relative to God. Yeah?
So this, I came across this sentence that says, enforce upon his mind a strongly binding conviction of the divine purity and justice. This profound certainty in his soul became the lens through which Eliphaz interprets the sombre enigmas of life, no rule between the problem of himself.
Yes, that is exactly the passage that I had in mind with the question.
So what does that sentence, binding conviction of the divine purity and justice, mean?
It means that his direct or personal experience of God, what he derived from it, whatever that experience is, because that's always something that's sort of inaccessible. Someone's experience of God can be described, but you can't have their experience. But whatever that experience was, what he learned from it, the lesson that he took from it, was that God is utterly holy, and particularly in the context of the ancient Near East, holiness comes with a strong sense of untouchability. What is impure or unholy or defiled in some way cannot come into contact with what is holy, or it will be destroyed. Not because the holy thing, particularly in the context of Israel, it isn't necessarily the case that the holy thing is angry that you touch it. It's that holiness overwhelms unholiness. Unholiness is overwhelmed by holiness and is destroyed or just swallowed up by it, consumed by it. And therefore it is not safe for what is unholy to come into the presence of what is holy. So whatever Eliphaz's experience was, what he derived from it was a very strong notion that God is utterly holy and pure, and therefore we can't, and that humans are all not that way. And so it is folly to demand God come to you and give an explanation, because when you put that unholiness and that holiness together, you're a goner.
We have that same notion in the prayers before communion. There's this long prayer that has phrases in it like, if the communion touches impure lips, lest it be burned, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So we have that notion in our prayers also.
We have, interestingly here, Eliphaz is not entirely wrong. His understanding of the utter holiness and purity of God is not mistaken. But is that the entire picture? Is that the truth alone? Is there something else that nuances that vision, that understanding? Is it ever the case that we approach God having achieved total purity, worthiness, and holiness ourselves? So how is it that we manage to do so without being destroyed? Well, but what is it about God that allows us to approach Him despite the fact that we are, perhaps as Eliphaz says, impure? It's God's love and compassion. So God is able to what's the best way to say it? His holiness does not act like some sort of impersonal force. Like gravity, if you let something go, it's falling no matter what. Doesn't matter how, it doesn't matter what it is. It's going to the ground. Slow or fast, it's going to get there. God's holiness is not like gravity, an impersonal force that just acts. It is who He is, but who He is also divine compassion and love. And so the holiness exists in conjunction with that and is mitigated by that, such that that it is possible to approach Him without being swallowed up by His holiness, destroyed by His holiness, because we are also approaching one who is compassionate, one who is merciful, one who is forbearant. And this is what Eliphaz doesn't seem to have much of a handle on. He doesn't see that. He sees the opposites, or he sees what he thinks are the opposites, the holiness of God, and therefore what must be the absolute folly of Job. And he can't see any way to connect these two things without Job cottoning or owning up to something that he has not done.
The difference in approaches between Eliphaz and the eventual getting onto the story, where God appears and makes everything right with Job, reminds me of the debate in the epistles about earning salvation. Can you earn salvation through your good works, or is salvation a gift? And that's kind of what it comes down to here as well, because both Job and Eliphaz are arguing in terms of justice. Job says, well, I didn't deserve this, and I deserve my day in court. I should be able to prove to God that this is not right for me. And then Eliphaz is saying, well, God is just, and if this has happened, it must be because you did something bad. And eventually that's what he says.
He's begging the question.
And then at the end it comes down to, I will favor whom I will favor. And God does good things for Job in the end that don't necessarily correspond to a legalistic approach to justice. God gives Job, restores Job, his children, and so forth, because he wants to, because he does, without being bound by human justice. It's kind of the same argument about grace versus works. What else have to say?
I think it's a very insightful comment, and perhaps it shows the way these categories sort of these categories, or even the disagreements, pre-exist the debates in the New Testament about very similar things. And they reflect our tendency to want God to work in an automatic and kind of predictable way. I'm going to turn the volume down here just a little bit. Hopefully, sorry about that. The volume adjustment is on the back. My fault. Maybe it reflects our tendency to want God to work in a very predictable way, in a sort of an automatic way. If I do X, I get Y, which is, how Job and his comforters seem to be operating, or at least with this presumption. But it's not always quite that way. We have freedom because God has, or is, freedom, and that's always going to put a bit of a wrinkle in any kind of rigid structure that you put up. So Eliphaz, in his perspective on Job's suffering, misreads the situation. How does he misread it? Eliphaz sees the situation, Job's suffering, as what? As punishment. From the blessed perspective of the reader, what is happening? Trial. Eliphaz sees this situation as punishment for something Job has done wrong. We know that this is a trial that the devil has asked God to allow, and that God has granted permission for. And that makes the situation very different. As Father Patrick points out, from the outside, it can look very much the same. Trial and punishment can look, or testing, if we want to use that word, testing and punishment can look very similar. The reasons for them are very different, and that makes a big difference. That makes a big difference in terms of how one approaches what's going on. And that makes a big difference. That's a matter of continued dispute between Job and his comforters as well. Eliphaz's perspective here they will assume that it is true, and Job will continue to insist that it is not. He doesn't offer an alternative. Job himself does not understand that this is not punishment. But he's going to insist that it is unfair, unjust, and therefore that there must be an explanation. I want an explanation. But it isn't a punishment at all. What distinguishes the three comforters in their response to Job? Well, I would say the different quality of their view on what Job is going through. How does it differ? What's...
You have someone who's he knows a lot, and then you have one that doesn't quite know, and then you've got one that's just opinionated.
Right, and do you recall exactly how Father Patrick distinguishes those levels? Real vision, accepted teaching, and blind prejudice. So Eliphaz has a direct experience of God. And when we get to Bildad is going to respond from the vantage point of inherited wisdom. And finally, we're going to get blind prejudice.
He says here, ask the generation past, study what their fathers have searched out, for we are yesterday, and we met them, and they enters the channel. Surely they will teach you and tell you. So that's where the nation comes from, grace. And Bildad is passing on.
Right, he's going to be appealing to the aphoristic knowledge of the ancestors. Now, recall, let's go back to the very beginning. There are two basic categories of wisdom literature, right? And the first category, the larger, more general category is, does anybody remember? Practical. It's practical wisdom. The kind of aphoristic wisdom that's passed down, that one gives to one's children or one's grandchildren about how to manage everyday life. Wisdom on avoiding, loose women, or lending money to an untrustworthy person, or lending money at all. How to have a good family. This kind of stuff. The other kind, which is the kind of literature we're reading, is speculative wisdom. That's intended to deal with questions that are far more thorny, far less immediate, and far less common. So when Bildad appeals to the ancestors, he's trying to appeal to a kind of aphoristic wisdom that doesn't really address the question. He's trying to cram Job's experience into a different category, answer it with aphorisms, with truisms that apply to a lot of everyday situations, but not necessarily to this one. So we see he's trying to see it through a lens that makes it easy for him to find a solution to the problem. Rather than seeing the problem, he's trying to find a way to make it fit into what he feels comfortable addressing it from. Right? Bildad's got a hammer and a nail, and by God, Job's problem is going to be a hammer and a nail. So while Bildad's approach may be less helpful, or even making a sort of a category mistake, he's still drawing on wisdom. He's drawing on something real, and something that is certainly helpful in a lot of ways. But why is the simple prejudice of Zophar Elihu not as valuable as the other two approaches? Tell me why that is. Obviously the word simple prejudice itself is loaded in such a way as to warn you off it, but why? It depends on the same aphorisms, but why isn't it helpful? What's the difference between aphoristic knowledge and simple prejudice? There you go. Great answer. It's on the surface. It's unexamined. The difference between aphoristic knowledge and simple prejudice is that simple prejudice is something you can reach for and throw out there without thinking at all. It's a matter of actually not wanting to enter into the question on any level. You just want to be able to slap an answer on it and get it out of the way. And dispatch, it's a way of actually glossing over problems so that you don't have to deal with them at all. You can just label it, throw something at it, and get it out of the way and move on with your life. It's dismissive. It doesn't actually want to deal with the problem. It just wants to move it out of the way. And that is why you want to be careful. We have a lot of aphoristic knowledge in our tradition. Particularly those of us who come from backgrounds where there's a lot of inherited wisdom or even cliche passed down generation to generation. You want to be careful with it because it's very easy to throw it out there unreflectively without having, as a way of not, rather than entering into the problem, just trying to dismiss and get something out of the way. And that's not helpful at all. And it also does not actually indicate any real wisdom or understanding on your part. You don't learn anything by doing that. How does the tenor of the conversation change as it progresses?
More strident, more polarized, and less trying to connect with each other.
More strident, more polarized, less connected. They're talking past each other, or at certain points it almost seems like the shouting.
funny thing is that in his first speech, Eliphaz is saying, we know you're a good guy, and you have said this to lots of other people. Since you're a good man, you know that things are going to turn around and everything's going to be all right. But by the time it gets to the second speech, he's saying just the opposite. You must have done something really bad.
Right. And that is, why is that?
Just because Job isn't doing what he's telling him to. He's getting frustrated with him.
Right. Job doesn't respond. Job does not see the situation the way he sees it at all.
He's sticking to his guns.
He's sticking to his guns. And so, and here I am going to appeal to a cliche. When men encounter a problem, what men want to do is to find a solution to that problem as quickly as possible, fix it, and move on. Well, Eliphaz has a solution. I'm going to tell you what you've done wrong. Here's how you fix it, and then we'll just get on with things. We don't have to hang around here for another week. We've been sitting here a long time. Let's just get this fixed. And Job says, wrong. That's not it at all. Which, of course, irritates Eliphaz. And it irritates his other comforters, too. It's frustrating. But recall also that they are not, that they are coming to this with a perspective that is mistaken. They mistake the kind of situation Job's in. They see it as a punishment. And so that determines for them right there what the appropriate set of responses can be. And so the whole set of responses, increasingly shrill, is rooted in the fact that they have a fundamentally different perspective on what's going on here in the first place. You have transgressed somehow and God is punishing you. And Job's going to say, no, I haven't. I have not. And whatever is happening here, it's certainly not because I have done something unrighteous. And he's going to continue to insist on his innocence. And they're going to continue to insist on his guilt. And because he won't change his perspective, and because they can't see anything else, they're going to do what people do when they get into disagreement. They're going to start badgering him. If I can't get you to see things my way by reason, then maybe I can bully you into it. Maybe I can badger you until you come around to my way of doing things. If you won't come along with me willingly, perhaps I can bludgeon you into coming my way. And this is something that a lot of people do. This is something you see all the time, especially if you're on social media. You disagree with somebody and it starts out and they're very polite and they're saying nice things about you, and before the end of it, they've used every curse word they can think of. They've insulted your mother and your entire family and suggested that your pets would be better off elsewhere. It's worth, again, taking a hint here. It's not always the case that we're wrong. But it's when you come to a situation with someone where you are at absolute loggerheads, it's worth stopping and saying, is this because the whole assumption of what's happening here to start with is different? Like our very foundational assumptions of what's going on here in the first place are different. And that we're never going to agree as long as we don't agree on that. It's something to think about when you run into a disagreement with someone. Moving on to chapter 5. And that chapter only took us 16 minutes. We are moving in the right direction. What is Eliphaz's response in chapters 4 and 5 to Job's lament in chapter 3?
Starts calling names, just like on Facebook. Vexation kills the fool. He starts tossing the fool word around.
Job, you're a fool.
That's right.
And in modern words would say, you idiot. You don't get it. You don't see it. God, don't you know? I know God is holy and pure. I have had this experience. And I also know that people are not. And why can't you see what's right in front of your face? Look at yourself. The only reason this happens is because you do something wrong. There's no other explanation for it. Come on, man. they fail to see in Job's situation something we talked about. We haven't identified it by name specifically, but we've certainly talked around it a lot. What do they fail to see when they look at Job? What are they blind to? It's something much more existential, and just right there right in front of you. So let me back up and ask the question in a different way. Job has this long lament, the substance of which is why, which they take as an invitation to give responses, answers, to try to get a solution. And that shifts them into a particular way of seeing Job and his situation. Everything becomes about theology at that point, which blinds them to what? That he's in pain, seeing him as a person. That's right. They stop seeing Job's pain. They stop seeing Job's suffering, and all they start to see is Job's problem. Job's theological problem. So they become blind to his suffering, to the fact that they're sitting with a man who's just lost his children and his wife. That goes out the door. And and that affects how they treat him, how they respond to him at every turn, all the way through. So, why are they more interested in identifying the fault than they are in seeing Job as the man?
Because it makes them feel safe. If what's happened to him has happened because of something that he did, they know they didn't do it, and it's not going to happen to them next. So.
It makes them feel safe. That's certainly part of it.
Also, if you're around someone that's having deep pain, often you try to avoid that pain. You want to protect yourself under the emotion. That's one thing.
Right. It can be a scary thing to enter into that pain. But there's also a deep desire to do something to make it go away. Like you don't want to just be there, you want to do something. Right? Whenever there's a crisis, everybody wants to do something. We react. But sometimes doing something is not the thing that's helpful. There's definitely a desire to avoid pain, especially pain we can't do anything about. If we acknowledge that there's no ready solution or remedy to be sussed out here, then what's left to us but to sit there? And that's a lot harder to do. That doesn't come naturally. That's difficult. And here there's a helpful distinction to make between between people who are close and people who are distant. So the further you are away from the locus of the suffering, the more helpful practical engagement as opposed to empathic engagement is. So I'm not in Puerto Rico. The Puerto Ricans don't need me to feel their pain. They don't need me to take on an emotional load. They need me to send money or food or water or whatever it is that they don't have now, right? From a distance, what people often need is practical, tangible support. what people need from those who are really close to them is the being with, so that they're not alone. Very often we make a mistake. Here we make a confusion. We want to empathize with people who are far removed when what they need is practical help. I mean, when I make practical help, I mean even literally just prayer. And when someone is suffering close to us, what we want to do is we want to give them practical help, when sometimes what they need is for us to be with. Just to be with them so that they're not alone. And it doesn't even have to be the case that you try real hard to feel their feelings. If you're able to just be there with them and let them have their feelings with you there with them, so that they're not alone. But we oftentimes confuse these things and we switch them. When they're close, we want to do something. And when they're far away, we want to feel. And that's backwards. We've got to do it the other way around. And you have to make a determination then, how close am I? Am I close enough that I need to feel with them? Or am I far enough back that I need to offer some tangible support? It's the difference between going and sitting with someone when their loved one has died and sending flowers or a card or food to the house so they don't have to cook, right? There's that ring that's outside of the immediate suffering where the tangible support needs to come from, while those who are closest offer that emotional support. What can we learn about our own response to the suffering of others from this chapter?
Jenny mentioned this book, Harold Kushner, who's a rabbi, when bad things happen to people. And it made me cringe, because I thought, so what's next?
Oh.
The whole first
Oh my
chapter
God, I can't believe
is-
this.
Do you know this book at all?
I'm familiar with the title. I haven't read it.
Well, so he's this young rabbi, and his son is diagnosed with progeria, a genetic disease where he's destined to live to age 14. So this book is about, the whole first chapter, you get the feeling that it's about things that were said to him, as a way of trying to comfort him, and why they weren't comforting to him. And it's things that we all say. They're all very common things. And it reminds me of the comforters here, because they'll say over and over again why this was not helpful to me. One of the, just for example, one of them was a woman who was told, well, this happened to you because God knows that you're strong enough to handle it. God won't send you any burdens that are too strong for you to bear. And her response in her mind was, if I had just been weaker, I would still have my child with me.
Right?
So there's one after another thing like that. So that's
And I was cringing because it is so easy to have this type of response.
It is. It's so easy, and it's hard. You want to say something. Nature abhors a vacuum. It's quiet. Somebody's crying, or they're just sitting there shell-shocked, and you want to fill up that space somehow. So that so that you don't feel all of that weight bearing down on you. Everybody wants to make it better. But it's very often the case that by trying to do that, we make it worse. Yeah. Sometimes, very often, what they just need. I had a friend. I haven't seen her in a number of years, but we kind of keep touch loosely through Facebook. She had a stillborn baby this last week. And she put up a very beautiful picture of her holding her newborn who had passed. Dealing with the suffering in a pretty emotionally healthy way. And she put on Facebook a note for her friends, because she's far away from most of the people that she has known over the years. She said, there's no right thing to say. Just say something. And all she wanted was for people to just to send a note and say, I care. I love you. I'm sad. I'm praying for you. Something like that. Which sounds so mundane. It doesn't seem helpful at all, right? But all it is just it's like a hand on the shoulder. I'm here. And that's really what people need. You can't fix the problem, you can't take away the feeling, and you shouldn't. Because the way healing comes is by going through, not going around the pain and the suffering. You have to go through that. And so even if you could take it away from someone, you wouldn't be helping them. You'd be harming them. But when you go through something difficult, it's a little easier if you don't have to go through it all alone. So just, I'm here. I love you. I care. That's what she needed, and she was wise enough to be able to say that. Moving on to chapter 7, how does the focus change?
What happened to 6?
Did we skip 6?
Yes. That's okay.
No, we did 6. I may not have mentioned that we had switched. So we're talking about what the comforters fail to see in a situation, how they overlook his suffering. All that's from chapter 6. So I'm sorry. That's my mistake, guys. How does the focus change in chapter 7?
Just before you go on.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Just one other thing. In the middle of chapter 6, Job lets his comrades know that he's not getting much comfort from their comforting. He tells them, "Thy comrades are fickle like a wadi, like a bed on which streams once ran. They are dark with thy snow exclusion. But when they thaw, they vanish. In heat, they disappear."
That's a pretty powerful image.
He tells them, "You guys are not acting the way Spanish again."
You guys are why are you here? This is awful. Yeah, he doesn't come right out and say that was not a question I wanted you to answer, but he gives them some pretty strong hints that they're not helping, that they're making things worse. And it's interesting, when that wadi dries up, that means he's all alone without water in the desert. So it's not only just you're like a stream that evaporates when the heat comes. It's now I'm all alone here without any thirst, without anything to quench my thirst. You could have been that cool water that makes this heat bearable, but you're not. Whew, that's powerful. How does the focus change in chapter 7?
Job quits talking to his friends and starts talking to God.
Yep. He's realized by this point that, like he says, you guys are a dry stream bed. There's nothing to be gained from talking to you anymore. So he takes his case to the highest court. So he has gone past the Court of Appeals, and he is now on his way to the Supreme Court with his motion. I am innocent. This is not just, and I want an explanation. What has suffering done to his perspective?
Job begins to turn his lament
Job begins to turn his lament
into prayer.
into prayer. What does he want from God?
He wants a hearing. He wants justice.
That's right. He wants a trial. Because he is absolutely confident that if he is put on trial, he will be vindicated. I have done nothing unrighteous before God. I have been faithful to obey the law. The law, as he articulated it in the beginning, to be fair and to be charitable and to pray and to not to defraud anyone in the marketplace, that kind of thing. It's very basic, straightforward morality. He is unimpeachable in that way.
The other way that his perspective changes, though, it's interesting. He goes from Job talking to his friends to Job representing all of humanity, talking to God. His perspective changes through his suffering. He starts to identify himself with the rest of suffering humanity. He says, "What is man that you make much of him, that you fix your attention upon him?" So it's not just that the person who's depressing changes, but he now sees and speaks as if he's speaking for all of humanity. He identifies himself with human beings in general.
And we see there that literary level peeking through.
Yeah.
The book of Job being fashioned as a way of addressing this whole question of suffering. Now Job has become a symbol of every person who's gone through this same kind of suffering. So now anyone who has experienced tragedy is identifying with Job and looking for this same answer. They can also be saying, I want this trial. I want an explanation from God. What does not change about Job's understanding of his relationship with God?
He still believes God is just, even though he believes God doesn't understand his case and he hasn't heard him. He still expects justice from God.
His view of who God is has not changed. He has not decided that God is capricious or evil or unfair. He doesn't understand why this is happening. But his perspective on who God is has not changed. And he's absolutely unwavering in his conviction that he has done nothing wrong. That he's been insulted, derided, badgered, henpecked, nagged, insulted, and none of it has rocked his sense of self here. He is still convinced that he has done nothing wrong. So he has kept his feet on the ground, both in terms of who he is and who God is, despite this whole existential crisis that's going on within him, and then the dramatic tension that is taking place between him and the men who have come to help him. He still has not lost those two bedrock convictions of him, that he has himself. Which is kind of amazing. I mean, most of us are inclined at a certain point to start doubting, well, maybe I have. I mean, think about anybody who's ever been wrongfully convicted and had their trial overturned years later. Almost all of them at a certain point said, well, maybe I did do it. You know, they go hours and hours of being badgered and questioning, and at a certain point they're like, I heard about a case the other day of a guy who was in prison for 19 years, who was, eventually DNA evidence proved that he was not connected at all. But at a certain point, after he'd been questioned for hours and hours, he said, I don't remember doing any of that, but I guess I did.
False confession.
Yep. All of us are inclined to do that, so it's kind of amazing that Job doesn't.
Torture.
It will. But it's a sort of a remarkable achievement for Job that he neither loses his sense of his own justice or his sense of God's own righteousness. It shows you what a strong person he is. What problem does Job's suffering raise in his mind? We're going to finish up here because we're already a few minutes past our time.
He never says God isn't just, right?
Mm-mm.
So he's God doesn't understand.
Well, if you compare it to what the comforters are saying, what did you do? What was your crime? What did you do to bring this on yourself? Whereas Job is saying, I have done nothing, why has this happened to me? So it's two different questions. The comforters are asking one question, and Job is asking a different question.
What does it raise in his life?
To me, it's the same question. Why has this happened to me?
That's one. I mean, Job is unyielding in that he does not know why this has happened. His comforters have all decided why it's happened. They're just trying to help him get to the solution. Here's what's happened. Here's what you got to do about it. And Job is still saying, wait a minute, we don't even know that's not why this happened. Why did this happen? This doesn't make any sense. So Job is still back on what's the problem here in the first place. The comforters decided that right at the beginning and moved on to the next phase, but that's not where Job refuses to go there with them. Why does God let this happen? And again, we're back to that why that everybody asks when they go through suffering. Why does this happen? And in terms of our own lesson, we want to be reluctant to answer that question. When someone asks, why did this happen? When someone asks me that question, I almost always have a very reliable, strong theological answer. Questions of suffering are not really impossible to deal with, theologically, philosophically, though they can be difficult. But I almost never want to answer that question. Because it's very easy to become like one of Job's comforters. Offering understanding or knowledge or bad cliches when that's really not what's necessary at all. And we do that in our own life. We do that in our own life all the time. We want to bring everything up to the level of the mind. And if I can apprehend it with my mind, then I've got some control. And if I can control it, I can manage it, I can affect outcomes, I can make things work out. But that's not really the best way to go about our own spiritual life or working things out. I mean, there are practical problems. Certainly the mind is the place to work them out. But that's not really the place to work out the spiritual crises of our own existence. Anyway, next time we will go chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. 8 through 11 next time. God bless you all. Bye-bye.